Imagine a boy sitting in a dim-lit kitchen, his family barely scraping by, counting every single grain of coffee to make the week's supply last. That boy was John D. Rockefeller. His father, William Avery Rockefeller Sr., nicknamed Devil Bill, by some, was a traveling salesman who disappeared for weeks at a time, leaving home in shambles. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, kept the family afloat. 6 children, constant moves, no luxuries. He learned early, save every penny, trust no one, the world doesn't owe you anything. And yet, only a few decades later, that same boy would become the richest man in American history. He would build a company that refined nearly all the oil in the United States, reshape an entire industry, and leave a fortune so vast it still staggers the modern mind. But behind those meteoric heights lay a decision, a turning point, a gamble so audacious it nearly cost him everything. What happened between the boy counting coffee beans and the titan commanding an empire of oil? Stay with me because you're about to see how the unlikeliest rise became the most feared monopoly America had ever seen. And one misstep, just one, could have unraveled it all. John Davidson Rockefeller would one day be called many things: a visionary, a monopolist, a genius of organization, the most powerful businessman America had ever produced. But in the beginning, he was nothing more than a quiet young man in Cleveland, Ohio, carrying heavy responsibilities on thin shoulders. He wasn't born into prestige. He wasn't groomed for influence. He spent his early years learning restraint, watching every coin, and studying the world with an intensity that many around him never understood. What set him apart wasn't loud ambition. It was something far more enduring: discipline. By the age of 16, he was already working as an assistant bookkeeper, earning 50 cents a day. And while other young men his age chased excitement or drifted through life without a plan, Rockefeller treated every entry in every ledger as if it held the key to his future. He memorized prices, calculated risks, observed patterns, and developed a belief that order could solve almost any problem. He wrote down every dollar he earned and every dollar he spent. He studied the habits of successful merchants. He examined markets not for what they were, but for what they could become. Even then, he was preparing for a world that no one else around him could see. And yet, even with that discipline, even with that determination, no one, not his employers, not his family, not even Rockefeller himself, could have predicted that he would rise from a modest clerk to the architect of a business empire. Because the moment that would change everything hadn't arrived yet. It was waiting for him, quietly just beyond the horizon. And when it appeared, it would alter not only his life, but the direction of an entire nation. Long before John D. Rockefeller became a name that dominated headlines, he lived in a world marked by instability. His father, William Avery Rockefeller Sr., was a man who drifted from town to town selling herbal medicines and miracle cures, leaving behind unanswered questions and a trail of uncertainty wherever he went. There were weeks when the family didn't know when he would return, or if he would return at all. His mother, Eliza, held the household together with quiet strength. She raised 6 children with limited resources, teaching them restraint, patience, and the importance of steady habits. Rockefeller would later credit her with shaping his sense of order, but as a boy, he felt the weight of responsibility far earlier than most. At times, he watched his mother stretch food supplies until they nearly ran out. He saw bills arrive that couldn't be paid at once. He listened to conversations whispered late at night, conversations about finances, debts, and the fear of unexpected setbacks. These moments formed the foundation of his character. While other children played freely, Rockefeller took on chores, learned the value of work, and began earning small amounts selling turkeys, potatoes, and small items to neighbors. Every coin mattered. Every expense had to be justified. He understood early that life demanded consistency, even when the world around him wasn't consistent at all. But beneath the disciplined exterior he was building, there was pressure. Pressure to help support the family, pressure to step into the role his father rarely filled, pressure to rise above circumstances that could pull a weaker person down. When he turned 16, he set out to find work in Cleveland, walking the streets for weeks, knocking on doors, and introducing himself to businesses. Dozens of offices said no. Some didn't bother to respond, but he returned every day, keeping a record of every attempt in a notebook. And then finally, a small firm, Hewitt and Tuttle, offered him a position as an assistant bookkeeper. The pay was modest. The workload was heavy. Yet to Rockefeller, it felt like the first stable ground he had ever stood on. Still, beneath that small victory was the same reality that had followed him since childhood. Nothing came easily, and nothing was permanent. What he didn't know was that this early struggle, this constant search for stability, would shape every decision he made in the years to come. It would prepare him for a world defined by risk, competition, and the relentless pace of an emerging industrial age. And just as he was learning to steady his life, a new force was rising in America, one that would test him, challenge him, and ultimately offer him an opportunity that no one else recognized. First taste of business. At Hewitt and Tuttle, Rockefeller found something he had never known before. A world governed by records, numbers, agreements, and consequences. It was a place where emotion had no influence. Only accuracy mattered, only discipline mattered. Every morning he arrived before the doors opened. Every evening he left long after others had gone home. He studied ledgers line by line, memorizing prices of grain, freight costs, seasonal changes, and every small pattern buried in the columns. Most people saw bookkeeping as mundane work. Rockefeller saw it as a language that revealed how money truly moved. He watched merchants negotiate deliveries. He observed partners debating risks. He witnessed what happened when men made decisions without planning, without caution, or without understanding their own accounts. He took mental notes constantly. If someone made a mistake, he learned from it. If someone succeeded, he studied why. But beyond the job, Rockefeller began making moves of his own. He started a small side business with a partner, Morris Clark. Together they bought and sold produce, cheese, grain, meats, operating with the smallest possible margin, always tracking every expense. The partnership taught him something crucial. Success didn't always belong to the largest operations. It belonged to the most efficient. Rockefeller insisted on contracts. He insisted on timely payments. He insisted that their books be spotless. This attention to detail, unusual for men so young, slowly separated them from competitors who relied on guesswork or luck. Each transaction strengthened his confidence. Each profitable deal confirmed that order and patience created reliable progress. While others took chances, Rockefeller created structure. While others hoped for good outcomes, he planned for them. Yet the world around him was shifting. New industries were emerging. New fortunes were being made. And although he didn't know it yet, a discovery in the hills of Pennsylvania would set his entire future on a new course, one that would test everything he had learned so far. The young bookkeeper, quietly refining his skills, was standing at the edge of an opportunity that would define the next century. All he needed was the right moment, and it was coming fast. By the early 1860s, John D. Rockefeller had built a modest but growing trading business with Maurice Clark. Their operations were careful, calculated, and profitable. But the world around them was anything but stable. The Civil War was shaking the nation. Prices rose and collapsed without warning. Railroads strained under military demands. Insurance costs spiked. And for a man like Rockefeller, who relied on structure, this unpredictability became a daily threat. As the war escalated, Rockefeller faced decisions that would have crushed many young businessmen. Contracts suddenly fell apart. Shipments were delayed for weeks. Some clients could not pay their outstanding debts. Every misstep drained their limited capital. Clark, more impulsive by nature, urged them to expand aggressively to make up for losses. Rockefeller insisted on restraint. The tension between urgency and discipline grew with each passing month. Then came the moment that struck hardest. A major deal, one they expected would stabilize their finances, collapsed entirely when the buyer failed to meet his obligations. Rockefeller had planned everything. He had calculated the margins carefully, but no calculation could stop a partner from defaulting in wartime. For the first time, Rockefeller felt the sting of failure on a scale that threatened his business. The firm struggled with cash flow. Creditors demanded payments, and Rockefeller, still only in his early 20s, carried the responsibility of keeping the enterprise alive. He tried to secure new financing. Some banks refused. Others offered terms so harsh they could cripple the business. He visited lenders repeatedly, presenting clean ledgers, clear accounts, and precise forecasts. Most still turned him away. There was a morning when he walked out of a bank office after yet another rejection, stepping onto the busy Cleveland street with little more than the weight of uncertainty. For a man who believed in order, that moment was deeply unsettling. He wrote in his personal notes about the strain of those years, the pressure of maintaining his business, and the necessity of making every dollar count. But failure, for Rockefeller, became a teacher rather than a barrier. It forced him to strengthen his resolve. It proved that discipline alone was not enough. He needed direction, a field where structure and planning could be scaled beyond ordinary commerce. And just when the tension seemed unending, news began to spread beyond Ohio. Reports of a new discovery, something happening hundreds of miles away in northwestern Pennsylvania, reached Rockefeller. At first, it sounded like nothing more than another boom fueled by excitement, but the details caught his attention. The volume of demand, the potential scale, something significant was unfolding. Something that needed organization, precision, and control. Something that needed exactly the kind of mind John D. Rockefeller possessed. The opportunity he had been waiting for was finally emerging, not in his office, not in grain markets, but in the oil fields. This is a good stopping point to make sure the formatting is correct for your voiceover app. The turning point, in 1859, when Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania, most of the country saw the discovery as a temporary rush. Another fleeting craze like gold, exciting one day and forgotten the next. But when the first barrels made their way into Cleveland, Rockefeller studied them not with excitement, but with calculation. At that time, crude oil was unstable, messy, and dangerous. Wells erupted unpredictably. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. Many investors rushed in with no plans, hoping luck would carry them. Rockefeller had watched these patterns his entire life. Waves of enthusiasm followed by collapse, and he understood that chaos always created openings for someone who could bring order. He examined the refining process, the transportation challenges, the waste, the inefficiencies that others overlooked. To him, the real opportunity wasn't in drilling wells. It was in refining the crude into something valuable, something households and factories desperately needed. Kerosene, a clean-burning fuel that could illuminate the world. While others chased quick profits in Pennsylvania, Rockefeller focused on Cleveland, a transportation hub with access to railroads and the Great Lakes. It was the perfect place to refine oil at scale. In 1863, he took his first major step into the industry, forming a refinery with Samuel Andrews, an engineer whose technical skill matched Rockefeller's precision. Andrews understood the chemistry. Rockefeller understood the business. Together, they created a plant that operated with a level of structure few competitors could match. Rockefeller visited the refinery constantly. He watched workers, reviewed supply routes, measured waste, and documented everything. He reduced costs in areas others didn't even track. Every improvement, even the smallest, became part of a system that slowly separated their operation from the rest of the field. But the turning point came when Rockefeller realized something that would shape the rest of his life. The oil industry was not about luck or guessing or even technology. It was about consistency. The world needed a stable supply. Businesses needed predictable prices. Families needed a fuel they could trust. The industry was full of volatility. Rockefeller saw a future where that volatility could be replaced by structure. Then in 1865, an opportunity appeared that would test everything he believed. Maurice Clark, his longtime partner, wanted to expand rapidly, even if it meant taking on heavy risks. Rockefeller disagreed. Their tensions reached a point where progress became impossible. During a meeting to resolve the issue, Clark challenged Rockefeller publicly, insisting they settle the disagreement by putting the firm up for auction. Right there in the room, Partners and witnesses watched in silence as Clark made his offer. It was a moment Rockefeller had not planned for, a moment with consequences he could not evade. When the bidding began, Rockefeller remained calm. He understood the stakes: win the auction, and he controlled the refinery. Lose and his future in the oil industry ended before it even began. The final bid was $72,500, an enormous sum for a man of his age. Rockefeller accepted the terms and secured full ownership of the refinery. Years later, he would describe that day as one of the most important decisions of his career. With that decision, he crossed a line. He stepped fully into an industry that demanded unwavering discipline. And once he committed, he moved with a focus that few could match. From that moment, he was no longer a merchant dabbling in new ventures. He was an oil man, and the rise that followed would change the structure of American business forever. With full control of the refinery in 1865, Rockefeller began building a system unlike anything the young oil industry had ever seen. He believed that success didn't come from sudden bursts of opportunity. It came from perfecting each step, eliminating waste, and creating a structure that could endure storms that crushed others. Most refiners operated casually, taking in crude one month, struggling the next, shutting down when prices fell, and reopening when markets seemed hopeful again. Rockefeller refused to operate on guesses. He wanted stability, consistency, and precision. He reinvested relentlessly. No extravagance, no distractions. Every dollar went back into expansion, storage, transportation, and efficiency. He worked closely with Samuel Andrews to refine kerosene to a standard of purity few competitors could achieve. Explosions were common in the industry. Kerosene often arrived contaminated or poorly distilled. Rockefeller insisted on uniformity. He made sure his product burned cleanly, giving families a fuel they trusted in their homes. That trust gave him leverage. As demand grew, Rockefeller did what few dared. He began acquiring competing refineries throughout Cleveland. Some were struggling, some were poorly managed, others were profitable, but lacked the ability to scale. In each case, Rockefeller offered terms that often included cash, stock, or positions within the larger organization. Many accepted, not because they wanted to surrender, but because they recognized that Standard Oil offered a level of stability they could not create on their own. Rockefeller had a saying, "We must improve and expand, or we must yield to others." By the early 1870s, his operations controlled the majority of refining capacity in Cleveland, but he still faced a daunting obstacle: transportation. Railroads controlled shipping costs, and prices fluctuated constantly. For refiners without bargaining power, profits evaporated almost overnight. Rockefeller, however, approached the railroads with meticulous records, precise volume forecasts, and a promise that most competitors could not match: steady, predictable shipments. Railroads valued reliability, and Rockefeller delivered it. With large and dependable shipments, he secured rebates, lower rates that competitors couldn't obtain, allowing Standard Oil to sell kerosene at prices few could compete with. Competitors protested, newspapers debated it, but Rockefeller focused on operations, refining methods, and economies of scale. The result was transformative. Standard Oil operated with an efficiency that reshaped the entire industry. Waste from the refining process was turned into new products: lubricants, paraffin wax, petroleum jelly, naphtha, and more. By capturing value others discarded, Rockefeller strengthened his margins even further. He formalized the organization in 1870, giving it a name that reflected his philosophy: Standard Oil. A company built on consistency, reliability, and the reduction of uncertainty. But success invited scrutiny, and scrutiny brought pressure. Competitors believed he was expanding too quickly. Newspapers raised questions about his influence over railroad rates. Politicians wondered how one company could grow at such speed. Yet Rockefeller pushed forward. He believed that the more stable the industry became, the more the public would benefit. He believed that disorder harmed everyone: workers, families, and businesses alike. But as Standard Oil grew, the nation began to ask a question it had never asked before: how much power can one man hold over the lifeblood of an industry? As Standard Oil expanded beyond Cleveland, A new atmosphere began to surround John D. Rockefeller. Growth that once appeared orderly now raised questions across the nation. Competitors whispered that something was happening out of public view, something that could explain how one company moved with such precision while others struggled to survive. It began with the railroads. In the early 1870s, Standard Oil secured favorable shipping rates, agreements that allowed Rockefeller to transport kerosene at costs his rivals could not match. To Rockefeller, these arrangements were the product of disciplined operations and reliable volume. To his competitors, they felt like an invisible pressure that tightened every month. By 1872, these tensions reached a breaking point. A secret agreement between several major railroads and refiners, known as the South Improvement Company, came to light. Its purpose was to stabilize prices and coordinate transportation. But when letters and contracts were exposed, rivals accused Rockefeller of gaining an advantage through terms that could devastate independent refiners. Newspapers erupted. Headline after headline questioned how such an agreement had been formed without public oversight. Independent refiners gathered in meeting halls demanding answers. Some claimed their businesses were being threatened. Others said their shipments had suddenly become more costly. Rockefeller responded calmly. He insisted that the agreement aimed to bring stability to an industry plagued by volatility. An industry where sudden swings in transportation costs could ruin entire companies overnight. But public anger was already growing. Crowds marched. Editors wrote about fairness, transparency, and the fate of small businesses. The protests intensified so quickly that the entire South Improvement Company collapsed within months. Yet the damage had been done, not to Rockefeller's business, but to his public image. From that moment on, many Americans viewed Standard Oil with suspicion. The company was expanding rapidly, acquiring refineries in city after city. Each acquisition brought new criticism. Some refiners sold willingly, convinced Standard Oil could offer stability they could never achieve alone. Others claimed they felt pushed out, caught between shrinking profit margins and the growing scale of Rockefeller's enterprise. Rumors spread of quiet conversations, unexpected offers, and mysterious financial pressures. Some believed Rockefeller worked behind closed doors to weaken competitors before acquiring them. Others said the industry itself was changing so quickly that only a company with immense organization could survive. But what troubled the public most wasn't what they could see, it was what they couldn't. Standard Oil operated with layers of structure, subsidiaries, partnerships, and interconnected companies. To many Americans, it seemed impossible to understand where one branch ended and another began. Journalists started asking a question that followed Rockefeller for decades. How much influence does Standard Oil truly hold? In 1878, one report noted that Standard Oil's reach extended into pipelines, transportation networks, storage facilities, and refineries across multiple states. And yet the company kept its internal operations guarded, releasing limited information to the public. Meanwhile, independent refiners watched as their numbers dwindled. Some closed, some merged. Others fought desperately to stay afloat. Each shutdown added to the growing belief that the industry was tilting toward one figure, one company, with a momentum no one could stop. Rockefeller saw the situation differently. He believed consolidation protected the public from chaotic pricing and dangerous refining practices. He argued that Standard Oil brought order to an industry that had once been defined by fires, explosions, and unpredictable markets. To him, expansion was not a threat. It was a necessity. But outside his office, skepticism deepened. Critics questioned whether any industry could remain fair if one company grew too large. Communities debated whether efficiency justified the disappearance of small businesses. The controversy surrounding Standard Oil was no longer confined to refinery towns or railroad offices. It had become a national conversation. And as Rockefeller continued to expand his reach, the nation prepared for a clash that would define his legacy. Because as his influence broadened, America was beginning to ask an even louder question. What happens when one company gains control of an entire industry's future? By the late 1890s, John D. Rockefeller had become a figure surrounded by both admiration and uncertainty. Standard Oil was now one of the most dominant companies in the world. Its kerosene lit millions of homes. Its refineries set standards of efficiency unmatched anywhere else. But as Standard Oil's influence expanded, so did the public's questions. In cities like Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, former refiners still spoke about the years when their businesses had declined under the weight of shifting transportation costs and industry consolidation. Members of Congress debated the power of large corporations. Journalists attempted to understand the company's structure, but many doors remained closed and few insiders were willing to speak. And then, a new voice entered the conversation. Ida Minerva Tarbell, a quiet, methodical, investigative journalist, one of the most disciplined researchers of her time. Her childhood had been shaped by the oil industry. Her father had once worked as an independent refiner in Pennsylvania during the oil boom. She had seen firsthand how quickly fortunes could rise and fall. When she began her investigation into Standard Oil, she didn't start with rumors or accusations. She started with records, contracts, old letters, court filings, railroad data, public testimony, page after page, year after year. For months, Tarbell traveled across the country interviewing former employees, rival refiners, railroad executives, and anyone who had dealt with Standard Oil. Some spoke freely, others hesitated. A few asked not to be named. Slowly, a picture began to form, a picture built not on emotion, but on documents. Tarbell examined the events of the 1870s, including the South Improvement Company agreement that had collapsed under public outrage. She reviewed railroad schedules, freight rates, and shipping rebates. She traced how Standard Oil had grown from a regional refiner into a nationwide network of subsidiaries and partnerships. What she uncovered raised serious questions about the balance of power in American industry. She noted patterns in how transportation costs shifted for competitors. She pointed out mergers that occurred after periods of financial pressure. She documented testimonies from refiners who claimed their shipments became more expensive, while Standard Oil's remained stable. Tarbell's research wasn't rushed. It spanned nearly 2 years, and in 1902, her first installment of the History of the Standard Oil Company was published in McClure's magazine. The article landed with the force of a national event. Newspapers reprinted excerpts. Politicians quoted her findings. Families discussed her work around dinner tables. Each month, another installment appeared, detailed, precise, heavily documented. Tarbell's work didn't rely on dramatic language. It relied on evidence. And that made it impossible for the country to ignore. Readers were astonished at the scale of Standard Oil's operations. Many had never realized how closely railroads, pipelines, storage facilities, and refineries were connected. Tarbell's reporting revealed the structure of the organization with a clarity the public had never seen before. Standard Oil initially dismissed the articles. Executives argued that Tarbell misunderstood the industry. They insisted that Standard Oil's size allowed it to lower prices, improve safety, and benefit the public. But Tarbell's installments continued to appear, one after another, each supported by documents that she made available for verification. As more Americans read her work, support grew for an investigation into Standard Oil's power. Calls for government action became louder. Tarbell had taken a vast, complex industry and explained it in a way every citizen could understand. Rockefeller rarely responded publicly. He kept to his disciplined routines, attended church, and continued overseeing his philanthropic work. But privately, his advisors knew the national conversation was shifting. For decades, Rockefeller had been the most influential figure in the oil industry. Now a journalist armed with notebooks, interviews, and public records had become one of the most influential figures in shaping how the public understood him. And as Tarbell's investigation gained momentum, the United States government began preparing for a legal confrontation that would change the future of American business. A confrontation that would place John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil at the center of the most significant antitrust battle in American history. By the early 1900s, the evidence Ida Tarbell had painstakingly compiled had sparked a national conversation that could no longer be ignored. Congress began to scrutinize the scale of Standard Oil. Public outrage had reached a level where mere debate was no longer sufficient. Action was required. When in 1906, the federal government filed a lawsuit under the Sherman Antitrust Act, accusing Standard Oil of monopolistic practices. For decades, Rockefeller had anticipated competition, disruption, and market fluctuations. But a legal battle of this magnitude, led by the government itself, was unprecedented. Standard Oil's empire spanned the United States, controlling pipelines, refineries, storage facilities, and rail contracts. Breaking it apart would not be simple. Lawyers combed through records, accounting books, and shipping contracts. Witnesses testified for months. And yet, Rockefeller remained steadfast, continuing to manage his operations with the meticulous attention that had built the company. The court proceedings became a spectacle. Newspapers covered the hearings in detail, highlighting stories of competitors who had been forced to sell, of railroads offering rebates, and of the company's complex corporate structures. Every day, the public learned more about the power one man and his organization had amassed. Many viewed Rockefeller with suspicion. Others marveled at his discipline. Some criticized his methods. Others admired his vision. But no one could deny the scale of what he had built. Over the next 4 years, Standard Oil's legal battles became a blueprint for the nation on how to confront monopolies. Legal arguments, evidence, and strategy dominated headlines. Testimonies detailed how the company's efficiency and foresight had created market dominance. Opponents argued that such dominance stifled competition and limited choice. In 1911, the Supreme Court finally ruled. Standard Oil was to be broken into 34 separate companies. For Rockefeller, it was a legal defeat, but not a personal one. Many of the companies created from the breakup, such as Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, would continue to thrive, many under his direct influence or through shares he retained. The empire he had meticulously constructed had been divided, but the wealth he had amassed remained enormous. Even in the face of legal judgment, Rockefeller had built a system resilient enough to survive and adapt. For the public, the ruling was monumental. It marked the first time the United States had truly challenged a corporation of such magnitude. For Rockefeller, it was confirmation of a principle he had followed all his life. Structure, discipline, and foresight could weather even the most powerful external forces. Yet even in victory, the question lingered. How would a man who had spent decades shaping the oil industry redefine himself in a world determined to limit his reach? The answer would come through a transformation that few expected. A shift from empire building to a different kind of power: philanthropy. Rockefeller's influence had been challenged, but his legacy, in ways that would last far beyond oil, was just beginning. After decades spent shaping the oil industry, John D. Rockefeller found himself at a crossroads. The legal battles had tested his empire, and the public had questioned his power. Yet the man who had counted every penny as a boy now faced a different challenge: how to wield influence without fear, how to create a legacy that extended beyond wealth. Rockefeller turned to philanthropy. In 1891, he established the Rockefeller Foundation, a step that would redefine the purpose of American wealth. The foundation sought to improve public health, advance education, and address problems that governments and private institutions often overlooked. His contributions were enormous. Millions were invested in medical research, helping to combat diseases like hookworm and yellow fever. Universities, including the University of Chicago, received funding to establish programs that would educate generations of leaders. Unlike his business ventures, philanthropy was not about control or efficiency alone. It required patience, collaboration, and vision, qualities Rockefeller had honed over decades but now applied to causes with social and scientific impact. Friends and critics alike marveled at the scale of his giving. By the time he stepped back from active management, Rockefeller had donated hundreds of millions of dollars, a sum unprecedented in American history. Yet even in charity, he applied his signature discipline. He studied causes, evaluated outcomes, and prioritized long-term impact. Rockefeller approached philanthropy the way he had approached refineries, with precision, planning, and a relentless desire to make every effort count. Through these efforts, he reshaped the perception of wealth in the United States. A man once feared for his power in business became respected as a visionary in public life. And while Standard Oil had been broken apart by government decree, Rockefeller's influence continued. through institutions, ideas, and projects that endured far longer than the fortunes of any single company. By the time he passed away in 1937, at the age of 97, John D. Rockefeller had not only created one of the largest fortunes in history, he had redefined what it meant to wield wealth responsibly. The same boy who once counted grains of coffee now left a world transformed, showing that discipline, vision, and adaptability could create a legacy far beyond personal gain. John D. Rockefeller's life teaches lessons that extend far beyond oil and finance. First, discipline matters more than luck. From counting grains of coffee to overseeing vast refineries, every detail was recorded, every decision calculated, every opportunity measured. Success rarely arrives without preparation, and Rockefeller's early habits shaped decades of achievement. Second, vision requires adaptability. He entered the oil industry cautiously, learned its complexities, and changed strategies when the world shifted around him. Those who fail to adjust, he proved, are left behind. Third, power carries responsibility. Rockefeller's empire created wealth, stability, and eventually controversy. But his later years showed how influence can be redirected to benefit society through philanthropy, research, and education. And finally, legacy is measured not just by wealth, but by impact. A fortune may fade, but systems, institutions, and ideas endure. Rockefeller's story reminds us that careful planning, relentless focus, and long-term thinking leave a mark far larger than any individual achievement. For those who study his life, the question is not simply how he became the richest man in America. The deeper question is, how can the lessons he left behind be applied today by anyone willing to combine patience, discipline, and vision into action? Yet even after a lifetime of unprecedented success in philanthropy, there remains a question that few have answered. What was the single choice hidden in the details of his early years that set John D. Rockefeller apart from every other ambitious man of his era? Some say it was his discipline, others his vision. Some argue it was the way he approached risk. The truth may never be fully known, but one thing is certain: the story of Rockefeller is far from ordinary. And as you reflect on his empire, one question lingers. Which modern billionaire has learned from his methods and taken them even further? The answer might surprise you. And the story of the next titan could be even more extraordinary than the first.